What force could compel a woman shackled by iron and unspoken vows to unleash a deed of such chilling accuracy, one that shattered the fragile veil of civility? Why did the lord of a sprawling Virginia manor forfeit not merely his command, but the very essence of his being under the veil of a balmy spring evening in 1834? And how did the raw, unyielding truth slip through the cracks of history, dissolving into echoes and a hush that clings like smoke, refusing to fade? If you're drawn to unraveling the ghosts of the past, tales that claw their way back from oblivion to expose the fractures in our shared memory, hit that subscribe button on the Forgotten Cell right now, and ring the bell for notifications. We chase the shadows others dare not touch. It was the year 1834, and in the shadowed hollows of Virginia's tidewater, the breeze hung heavy with the bittersweet tang of curing tobacco leaves and the loamy breath of rain-soaked soil. The Hale plantation loomed like a sentinel apart from the patchwork of modest homesteads dotting the landscape. Its timbers, gnarled and silvered by relentless summers and howling gales, framed a world unto itself. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy of ancient oaks, casting the panes of its windows in perpetual twilight. Here, the burden of generations settled like dust on forgotten ledges, and quietude didn't just fill the spaces, it devoured them, outlasting every fleeting utterance. Daily rhythms pulsed with the turn of the sun and the reap of the fields, yet beneath that measured cadence swirled undercurrents of disquiet, the kind that festered in the throat but never quite broke free. Among the souls tethered to this unforgiving earth was Sarah, a figure shrouded in the haze of rumor, her origins as elusive as a half-remembered dream. Whispers among the hands pegged her to the rugged hills of the Carolinas, while others murmured of distant harbors and the creak of slave ships slicing through Atlantic swells. She was lithe and young, her movements etched with an eerie composure that bordered on the ethereal, as if she'd been carved from the same unyielding wood as the house itself. Her labors unfolded flawlessly, her compliance a seamless veil over whatever storm brewed within. But there was a weight to her, an intangible pull that rippled through the air around her, stirring unease in those who brushed too close. The other laborers kept their distance, exchanging hushed asides and stolen glances, convinced she cradled secrets too perilous to unearth, like a locked chest adrift in a midnight sea, promising treasures or curses untold. Jonathan Hale, the unchallenged sovereign of this domain, cut a figure of formidable esteem among his equals, a landowner whose acres gleamed with prosperity, whose coffers brimmed with the fruits of calculated ambition, and whose demeanor demanded deference without a word wasted. To those he ruled, however, his precision took on a sharper edge, a scalpel in the art of command, wielded through terse edicts, unyielding corrections, and a stare that peeled back layers of facade until only raw vulnerability remained. Though he seldom deigned to summon Sarah by name, an electric undercurrent crackled between them, palpable to even the most oblivious soul in the household. It flickered in the way his gaze snagged on her silhouette as she glided past, a predator's appraisal veiled in indifference. It shadowed her features with a swift, involuntary flinch whenever his boots echoed on the floorboards. And in that charged space, a silent promise hung heavy as storm clouds. One day, the spark would ignite as the seasons edged toward that fateful cusp. The estate began to hum with subtle fractures, like hairline cracks spidering across fine porcelain. A sterling fork vanished from the sideboard, only to reappear days later tangled in the straw of the horse barn, its handle smudged with earth no one could explain. A heavy oak door, secured with a blacksmith's iron latch at dusk, stood ajar come morning, admitting a draft that chilled the bones. And then there were the phantom footfalls, soft, deliberate treads haunting the upstairs galleries well past the witching hour, when every lamp should have guttered out. These anomalies were brushed aside in hurried mutters or buried deep in the chest, for Hale Manor was no place for idle probing. Inquiries had a habit of evaporating like mist under the sun, especially if they veered too near the master's sanctum. Through it all, Sarah glided untouched, her countenance a serene mask, her duties dispatched with the relentless grace of clockwork, each fold of linen crisp, each polished surface gleaming, as if chaos itself bent to her will. Spring unfurled then, restless and voracious, drenching the lowlands in sheets of silver rain that turned meadows to mirrors and paths to quagmires of red clay. The earth seemed to groan under the deluge, mirroring the growing tempest within the manor's walls. Jonathan's silhouette haunted his book-lined study through the small hours, his strides devouring the Persian rugs in fits of muffled fury, a low growl of frustration seeping through the plaster like distant thunder. Word spread in the kitchens and quarters, of ledgers bleeding red ink, of shadowy creditors circling like vultures from Philadelphia's counting houses, debts that clawed at the edges of his empire. Yet the rituals endured, those lavish Sunday suppers, pageants of porcelain and crystal designed to project an illusion of unassailable order, where crystal glasses chimed like false alarms and silverware danced in deference to unspoken hierarchies. It was during these orchestrated symphonies of excess that Sarah's guarded gaze betrayed its first unguarded glimmers, not the raw terror of the hunted, nor the blaze of open rebellion, but a deeper ember, something forged in the crucible of endurance, sharp and unquenchable as a hidden blade. And as the weeks bled into one another, that quiet amassed like sediment in a riverbed, thickening the very atmosphere until it pressed against the skin. The corridors of Hale Manor seemed to contract, their paneled walls curving inward as if to cradle the untold burdens they absorbed. Sarah lingered there, a specter woven into the fabric of every chamber, her muteness not absence, but a taut silver filament lacing through the hours, drawing them inexorably toward a reckoning veiled in the folds of tomorrow. In a house built on silence, the old hands would later murmur, the loudest screams are the ones never voiced. That fateful Sunday draped itself over the plantation like a tailored shroud, a hush not of peace, but of meticulously rehearsed artifice, every gesture a thread in a grand brittle tapestry. By midday, the bustle ignited in controlled waves, figures darting through labyrinthine passages with the precision of dancers in a forbidden waltz, no shoulder brushing another, no voice rising above a conspiratorial murmur. Steam rose from bubbling cauldrons in the scullery, hissing secrets into the rafters. Hinges whispered as portals swung open and shut, guardians of hidden realms. In the grand parlor, Jonathan's hand-picked assembly trickled in at stately intervals. Gentlemen whose utterances carried the heft of minted gold, and ladies who collected them with the delicacy of seamstresses threading needles through silk. Their mirth erupted in clipped, varnished peals, blooming briefly before scattering into the ether like petals on a contrived breeze. The plantation's woes slumbered beneath the banter, a subterranean fire licking at the underbelly of every pleasantry, scorching the air with its unspoken heat. Sarah navigated this fragile ballet along its precipice, her poise a tightrope walk over an unseen abyss, eyes fixed ahead, steps measured and unhurried, as if the ground beneath her might crumble at any whisper of hesitation. She'd been conscripted for the night's tableau, a detail etched into the roster with the barest incline of a head. No fanfare, no query. Yet her orbit in these exalted circles sowed a subtle discord no one could pinpoint. She uttered not a syllable beyond the faint hush of her soul's unpolished heart pine. Her service was an extension of shadow, flawless and fleeting. Still, the gentlemen faltered mid-sentence as she leaned in to refill a goblet, their breaths catching on some primal snag. The women, schooled in the gentle erosion of edges to smooth social tides, felt their poise sag under an inexplicable anchor, a pull toward depths they pretended not to sense. She received each directive: pass the claret, clear the fowl, with the fluid yielding of river reeds in a gale, no ripple of protest, no arch of the brow. But oh, that yielding itself was a barb, a polished pebble lodged in the craw, slick, unyielding, defying every swallow. In the flicker of candlelight, as crystal caught the glow and shadows played across strained smiles, the evening poised on the knife's edge of revelation. And Sarah? She was the quiet axis around which it all turned, her silence not surrender, but the calm before the blade falls, sharp, inevitable, and forged in fires long since buried. Before the first chime of the evening bell, the cook, her hands roughened by years of kneading and scalding, slipped a warm, folded wedge of cornbread into Sarah's palm, a quiet ritual of compassion, a talisman against the gathering dark. Sarah secreted it away without a glance, as one might tuck a prayer into a pocket to ward off a tempest. That night, the dining room thrummed with the cadence of polished discourse, murmurs of last autumn's yield, the fluctuating pulse of market prices, dispatches from Washington's marble halls, and the clipped appraisal of a newly minted judge whose name hung briefly in the air like a plucked string. Jonathan Hale sat at the head of the table, his presence not merely worn but chiseled, each smile a calculated angle, each word driven into place with the precision of a surveyor's stake. His attention rarely grazed Sarah, yet it sought her all the same, slipping through the cracks of his restraint like a cold wind prying beneath a locked door. When she poured his wine, the crystal goblet stood resolute in her grip, unyielding as her resolve. When she set a platter before him, it kissed the damask cloth without a sound, her movements a silent current carrying only what was required. But within her the hours piled like stones, each moment a tally in a ledger that refused to reconcile, a debt written in shadows, its sum too vast for daylight to bear. What stirred in Sarah wasn't a memory in the shape of faces or names, but a deeper wound etched in the language of the senses. The crisp tear of linen rent apart, a whispered menace cloaked in the cadence of a hymn, the deliberate clink of a belt buckle meeting its own echo in the dark. These were fragments no tongue could confess, not in a world that demanded proof in ink and oaths. Silence, when learned by force, becomes a clock of its own devising, and Sarah kept its time in the rhythm of her steps, 37 paces from the kitchen's heat to the dining room's chill. In the seconds a hand lingered, grazing her wrist as she offered a dish, heavy with intent, in the way the word girl, when it fell from certain lips, became a key turning in a lock, sealing her within walls no eye could see. The air in the hall thickened as the meal wore on, not with the warmth of fellowship, but with the weight of things unsaid. Promises curled like smoke beneath the words, bartered in the tilt of a head or the length of a calculated grin. Alliances hardened in the pause before a toast. Jonathan's voice, when it wasn't gilded with laughter, cut through the room with a clarity that chilled, forcing heads to incline as if bowing to an unseen crown. He raised his glass with the ease of a conqueror, even as whispers of strained finances gnawed at the edges of his dominion. The candles, if you leaned toward poetry, seemed to rally behind him, their flames a silent chorus amplifying his command. Some men don't just sit at the table, they own the room, the old hands would later say, their voices heavy with bitter awe. When he turned to Mrs. Whitcomb, his words carried a barbed elegance that left her blinking, her answering laugh a touch too shrill, like glass struck too hard. Sarah, gliding to his right to swap an empty decanter for a full one, felt his gaze slide past her at first, roaming the room as if sampling its loyalties. Only when her breath brushed the rim of his glass did he pivot, his voice dropping to a murmur meant for her alone, a remark so threadbare it could have been about the vintage of the claret or a speck of imagined dust on the tablecloth. But woven into those syllables was a calculus, cold and meticulous, the kind that measures not just what can be taken, but how much can be claimed before resistance dares to stir. To the untrained ear it was civility itself. To Sarah, schooled in the art of hearing what's buried, it was a blade so fine it could part a single breath without drawing blood. She withdrew the decanter, her hand steady as stone, and he offered the faintest curl of a smile, a predator's acknowledgement, fleeting and final. The conversation surged back to its choreographed flow, but beneath the table, in the hidden geometry of polished boots and rustling skirts, a shard of her will hardened, clear and unyielding as amber trapping a long-dead flame. Some silences aren't empty, they're loaded, the cook would whisper later, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she'd seen the spark before it caught. The kitchen enveloped her in its pulsing heat, a world of scorched sugar and sizzling fat, where the air itself seemed to labor. A knife lay on a worn wooden block, its handle smoothed by countless grips, unremarkable among the clutter of ladles and tongs. It wasn't the grandest blade, nor the keenest, but it rested there with a quiet inevitability, as if waiting for a hand to claim its purpose. Sarah's fingers closed around it with the same calm she'd used to lift a basket of rolls, her touch as steady as the heartbeat of the house. The corridor back to the dining room felt tighter now, its shadows thicker, though her steps remained measured, each one a note in a song only she could hear. The swell of conversation greeted her return, forks chiming against porcelain like a metronome keeping time. No head turned as she entered, her presence as expected as the flicker of candlelight. She glided to Jonathan's side, the knife concealed in the folds of her cloth, her grace unbroken, a dancer moving through a final act. The moment hung fragile, a breath held in the space where choices become irreversible. Jonathan opened his mouth, perhaps to cast another veiled barb, but his words crumbled as her hand moved. It was no frantic gesture, Her motion was deliberate, a clean arc etched by years of silent precision, as inevitable as the fall of dusk. The knife found its mark, its purpose as singular as a vow kept in the dark. A stifled sound broke free, half choke, half struggle, then silence swallowed his voice where it had once ruled. In a single stroke she rewrote the room, the cook would later murmur, her voice thick with something like reverence. Sarah didn't linger to watch his face collapse into shock. She withdrew the blade with ceremonial care, crossing the short distance to the table's head, where she laid it gently on the silver platter before him, an offering to a god dethroned. The room seized, breath held in collective suspension. Guests stared, their eyes trapped between denial and the stark truth gleaming in the candlelight. Jonathan's chair scraped against the floor, a jagged protest, but no one rose to his aid. A silence descended, heavy and unyielding, sinking into bones and rooting there, deeper than any the manor had ever cradled. Beyond the walls, a clock ticked with relentless patience, counting seconds that felt like years. Sarah stood, hands empty, her gaze not on the man unraveling before her, but on the stillness she'd birthed, a quiet so profound it seemed to hum. For an endless moment, the room teetered, caught between the reflex of decorum and the realization that decorum had been shattered beyond repair. A guest stood, then faltered back into their seat. Another pressed a napkin to their throat, as if to shield a pulse too loud to hide. Words failed, for their meaning had been rewritten in blood and steel. Jonathan, once the evening's sovereign, shrank to the measure of his pain, his breath a ragged plea where command had reigned. The servants hovered at the edges, caught in the limbo of a world upended, waiting for an order that could stitch reality back together. None came. When the king falls, the castle learns to kneel, an old hand would say years later. Her voice soft as ash, scattered on wind. The gathering dissolved not by decree, but by instinct, a flock scattering before a storm. Carriages were called without goodbyes, their wheels churning the gravel in hurried retreat. The manor's doors closed behind each departure with a muted sigh, as if sealing a confession. In their wake, the house settled into a hush that was neither sacred nor mournful, but simply true, a silence born of what could no longer be denied. By dawn, the tale had outrun the swiftest horse, spreading through the county without need of roads. Each telling warped it anew. Some swore madness had seized the master at the precise moment his power met its mirror. Others spoke of a curse older than the oaks, demanding payment in flesh and bone. A doctor arrived, his bag heavy with bravado but light on cures. He applied leeches to a wound that mocked his skill, prescribed silence for a man whose voice had already been stolen, and declared with practiced solemnity that rest was the only remedy for a loss so absolute. Some claimed Jonathan tried to speak in the days that followed, only to find each sound a betrayal, a blade turned inward. Others said he learned swiftly that power needs no tongue, that a glance or a gesture could still bend wills, though the orchestra of his dominion now played out of tune. A man can rule without words, but not without fear, the scullery lad would mutter years later, polishing silver that no longer gleamed. The law arrived as it always did, too late to mend, too early to console. The sheriff stood where the table had been, his notebook open to questions that could never capture the truth. Names, times, the order of dishes served, the shape of the blade, the weave of the cloth. But no pen could chart the anatomy of silence, the weight of a glance held too long, the alchemy that turns shame into resolve. His report closed on hollow phrases, an unfortunate incident, a disruption at supper, the event of April 14th, words that reached for closure but fell short of meaning. The rest, it was agreed, was best left to the shadows of conscience, where truths too raw for daylight could quietly fester. The servants were summoned and dismissed in turn, as if their recollections could be marshaled like soldiers on parade. Each swore they saw nothing, heard less, their voices threading a needle through the fabric of denial. Sarah's name, when it surfaced, drew only blank stares and shrugs, a void so profound it became the fulcrum of all that followed. By the time dawn painted the fields in pale gold, she was gone. No trace in the dew-slick grass, no footprint in the tangled underbrush of the woods that swallowed her like a river closing over a stone. Whispers spun wild tales. Some claimed she rode north in a cart stacked with crates of flour and salt, its wheels creaking under a driverless yoke. Others spoke of a lone figure glimpsed at the river's edge, waiting for a ferry that never came. A story a boy later retracted, his sleep haunted by the shadow he'd sworn he saw. Patrols scoured the countryside with half-hearted steps, their lanterns dim against the vastness of her absence. Rewards were tacked to tavern walls, the sums climbing week by week, yet no one stepped forward to claim them. A path doesn't need a map to exist. It only needs someone brave enough to walk it blind, an old hand muttered years later, her eyes tracing the horizon as if Sarah's shadow still lingered there. The estate's ledgers told a sterile story. An entry for bandages, crisp new linens, a sum paid to quiet tongues that might wag, another to soothe guests whose silence could be bought, and a larger one for those whose loyalty wavered. A cousin's letter, penned with meticulous care, noted Jonathan's improving health in passing, adding almost as an afterthought that the household staff had diminished by one. A local gazette, eager to court progress without risking its readership, described the supper as an elegant affair, tainted by an unfortunate lapse in decorum. Weeks later, a cryptic line hinted at a dish served that night, unlike any known to local kitchens, only to be retracted after a stern visit from an unnamed caller, the correction buried at the page's edge where only the curious or the condemned would look, the manner adapted as a body does when a wound festers, by pretending the injury never existed. Jonathan retreated from the public stage he once commanded, his replies to invitations now sealed with wax and silence. At dusk he wandered his fields alone, a silhouette blurring into the twilight, neither breaking nor mending the horizon. A young niece swore he hummed ceaselessly, a thin, tuneless drone worn smooth by repetition, like a riverbed polished by endless current. His written orders, once sharp as his voice, faltered, his pen vigorous but the words scattering like leaves refusing the rake. Debts, once mere rumors, hardened into truth, and parcels of land slipped away under the cold gaze of surveyors who weighed dirt with tools and souls with a glance. The house opened its doors to strangers, tenants whose names never graced the family's leather-bound Bible, their lives a fleeting imprint on walls that remembered too much. Some places don't belong to the living anymore. They belong to the quiet, a tenant would later whisper, packing her bags under the weight of unseen eyes. Years rolled on, but the incident clung to the county like damp rot, indelible no matter how fiercely the cloth of memory was scrubbed. Those who'd sat at that table became reluctant keepers of their own stories, offering slivers of truth only to snatch them back, as if speaking them aloud might summon the moment anew. Some fled the region, citing reasons as flimsy as the excuses they left behind. Others stayed, their eyes sharpened by vigilance, as if the manor's walls whispered secrets they weren't meant to hear. The tale wove itself into the undercurrent of market stalls and church pews, surfacing only when a peculiar hush fell over a crowd, a shared pause as if all had caught the same distant echo and agreed to let it pass unnamed. Historians, decades later, clawed at the edges of the story, but the records mocked them with their sparseness. Letters vanished. Diaries ended mid-sentence, their pages ash in fireplaces owned by families who swore no such books existed. In the courthouse, a file for 1834 bore a precise excision where a report should have been, the paper sliced clean by a blade as sharp as the one Sarah wielded. Scholars, grasping at fragments, spun theories to fill the gaps. Some called it a myth born among the enslaved, a tale polished by retelling until it gleamed like fact. Others insisted it happened exactly as whispered, then scrubbed from history by those with the power to erase. The silence itself became evidence, a presence nurtured and guarded, a fortress against prying hands. Among the Hale lineage, the event was a forbidden shore, uncharted in family lore. Children were warned never to ask about the ancestor who lost his voice, nor to touch the locked trunk in the attic, its contents a mystery wrapped in dread. The prohibition calcified into instinct, passed down like a curse no one dared name. Yet attic doors creaked open under curious fingers, revealing relics that refused to stay buried. A photograph, its edges curled, the faces within more specter than flesh. A scrap of cloth stained dark at one corner. A letter, unsent, its ink steady as it confessed. She looked at me like she'd already seen the end. These finds were returned to their shadows without a word, as if discovery itself were a sin. Some truths don't want to be found, they want to be felt, an old hand would say, her voice barely above a breath. as if speaking too loudly might wake the past. Rumors of Sarah persisted, shape-shifting with each teller. Old men in roadside inns spoke of a woman in the Carolinas, silent save for a hum that was neither song nor prayer, her bearing that of someone who knew eyes followed her. Others claimed she traced the river to the sea, slipping onto a ship that asked no names, landing in a land where words were strange but silence was no debt. The stories never aligned, yet each carried a thread of certainty. Sarah hadn't vanished. She'd become untraceable, a shadow moving beyond the reach of chains or bounties. The manor itself never reclaimed its former glory, though crops still rose from its fields and its walls endured. Tenants passed through, their dreams and disputes leaving faint marks on a house that held older secrets. The grand dining room was sealed, not for repair but because it had outlived its purpose. Dust settled in its corners, respectful of the heir's unspoken claim. The silver service lay locked in a chest, the table's polish dulled by time's patient neglect. Visitors spoke of a presence that lingered, an unseen gaze, a rhythm like a key turning in a lock long since rusted away. The silence didn't fade. It grew, a legacy heavier than stone shaping those who lived in its shadow. Some shunned the estate entirely, others returned as if drawn to test their courage against its weight. But all left quietly, carrying memories that refused to dim. Sarah's absence remained the sharpest mark, untouched by time, a blade's edge that neither dulled nor broke. What she did could neither be undone nor repeated, settling into the only form that could hold it. A silence vast and unbroken, waiting still for a voice to claim its meaning. At The Forgotten Cell, we don't just tell stories, we unearth the truths that silence tried to bury. Subscribe now, and let's chase the shadows together.